Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to the COVID pandemic and the uptick in cases in some parts of the country. We go now to former FDA Commissioner and Pfizer board member, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Good morning to you, Doctor. I mean, the numbers compared to where we were, obviously, this is a dramatic improvement, but still 600 deaths a day. Here in the East Coast, we've had so many high-profile infections, the Attorney General, the Speaker of the House, the CIA Director, the Commerce Secretary. How do you characterize where we are right now?
Well, look, cases around the country are coming down. We have about 9 cases per 100,000 people per day. So prevalence is low. There's no question that we're experiencing an outbreak here in the Northeast, also the Mid-Atlantic, parts of Florida as well, which tends to track the Northeast. It's driven largely by B2. And I think that we're dramatically undercounting cases. We're probably only picking up 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 infections. So when we say there's 30,000 infections a day, there's probably closer to 250,000 infections a day. And they're concentrated in the Northeast right now. And that's because a lot of people are testing at home. They're not presenting for definitive PCR tests, so they're not getting counted. So when you look at the Northeast, for example, cases are up 89% over the last 14 days in Washington, D.C. They're up 58% in New York City, up 65% in New Jersey. So cases up in the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic are going up, but the rest of the country looks pretty good right now. And I think the net trajectory is that we're likely to get through this B2 wave. It's likely to be regionalized. I don't think it's going to become a nationalized epidemic of B2. And as we get further into the spring, we're likely to see these case counts come down, even here in the Northeast.
But from a practical perspective, when you say we're dramatically underreporting COVID infections, the guidance to the public is look at your local community infection level to make your own judgment. So if we can't trust the data at the local level, if the CDC is already saying, you know, things are looking great, how do I accurately judge what's actually happening and when I need to put my mask back on?
Yeah, well, CDC shifted a lot of their measurement towards hospitalizations and away from actually looking at cases. And hospitalizations are low right now. There's 15,000 people hospitalized. That's the lowest point we've been at any point in this pandemic. And I suspect hospitalizations aren't going to go up a lot because a lot of the people who are getting infected right now with B2 are people who escaped the B1 Omicron wave. And they escaped it in large measure because they were vaccinated, they were prudent, they took precautions, they tested. And so the simple fact is that a lot of the people who are getting infected right now are people who are vigilant, and they're more likely to take decisive action once they diagnose an infection, get treatments, things like that. So I don't think hospitalizations are going to tick up a whole lot. In terms of knowing what your local prevalence is, it's tough right now. I think you have to look at the state data, and you have to look at week-over-week increases and just assume that we're only capturing a very small percentage of infections. So if you see cases going up in your local community, that's a pretty good indication that there's more infection in what we're measuring.
So there are a lot of unmasked indoor events that are happening still here in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. Should the CDC change the definition of fully vaccinated to make sure it includes that booster dose? Does that make a difference?
The booster dose clearly makes a difference, not only in reducing your risk of getting infected and spreading the infection, but even more so in reducing your risk of having a bad outcome. I think we're in this unusual period right now where we're calling these boosters. We're telling that people who are vulnerable to the infection to get a shot every 6 months. That's effectively what we're doing to make sure that they're up to date and have maximal protection. And we're transitioning towards this probably becoming an annual vaccination starting this fall. The problem's been that we've been in continuous waves of spread. And so to maintain people's immunity, it's required, as this virus has evolved into these new variants, it's required a booster every 6 months. But I think the reality is that by the fall, this will become an annual vaccine. And then the CDC is going to talk about being up to date. Have you had your vaccine this season? I think they're reluctant to pull the trigger on that right now because they're uncertain about what the recommendation is going to be in the fall. But it's more than likely that there'll be a recommendation for everyone to get another dose in the fall. And that will be the start of this becoming an annual vaccine, I believe.
But some of the CDC guidance, like close contact, still remains at this 6 feet of distance, 15 minutes of time. Is that actually close contact? I mean, is shaking someone's hand and kissing someone on the cheek advisable right now?
Well, look, that's close contact, shaking someone's hand.
Even if it's less than 15 minutes?
Or hugging them is close contact. Well, I mean, that's the problem with the CDC guidance. The CDC guidance was always bizarre. It talked about 15 cumulative minutes as if this is radiation exposure, that you have increased risk from cumulative exposure. This is binary. You either catch it or you don't. What CDC is defining as a minimum standard for what they believe close contact is. But if you're hugging someone, that certainly supersedes 15 minutes of being around someone within 6 feet. And so we just need to be practical about this. Close contact is what we know close contact is. With respect to the president, I hope he does well and doesn't catch this. I do think he's probably out of the woods from his exposure to the Speaker of the House. But saying that that wasn't close contact, where we have pictures of him hugging the Speaker, that clearly was close contact. And I just think we need to be plain spoken and practical about how we describe these things.
Well, I think people appreciate you being plain spoken. So if you are here in an area where there is an uptick, do you send your unvaccinated child to school with a mask? And how long do those youngest children remain unvaccinated?
Yeah, look, I think that masks in very young kids has always been difficult because the young kids can't wear medical masks and they don't wear masks well. And the cloth mask isn't providing a lot of protection against this particular strain, which is probably an airborne virus. I think if you have an adolescent child or an older child who can wear a mask well and you have access to KF94 masks or KN95 masks that are comfortable or level 3 procedure masks and the child can wear it comfortably and it's not interrupting their school day, I think thinking about masking for a week or two when prevalence is high might be a prudent step to take. Masks should be something that we look to when local prevalence is high, something that we use for temporary periods of time. So you might want to think about it for a couple of week period while the prevalence is high. I think things will come down in the Northeast over the next 2-3 weeks. I think we're going to see things come down sharply. But right now, prevalence is pretty high in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. And
we're still waiting for May at the earliest for a kiddie vax?
I think at the earliest. So the data should be out from Pfizer in April. Moderna has obviously released their data. FDA has a lot of familiarity with these data sets, and so they could act quickly on them. Assuming the data comes out in April as is expected, I think the agency could potentially act in May. My hunch is it will slip a little bit because the sense of urgency will have dissipated because infection levels will be relatively low as we get into the spring.
Dr. Gottlieb, thank you very much for your expertise. We'll be right back. A new CBS poll shows a bit of a difference in how Americans are experiencing the economy. Although more than half of Americans say the local job market is good, almost 2/3 say the national economy is bad, as inflation and gas prices are seen as the biggest drags on the economy. We want to welcome to the program the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, Loretta Mester. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, it is, of course, the Federal Reserve's job to try to get this inflation under control. You're one of the few people who actually gets a vote in setting those interest rates. To be frank, it does seem the Fed was behind the curve on inflation. How do you make up for lost time and get it under control now?
Yeah, so, we are very committed to maintaining and achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and price stability, and we are taking actions. We have the process underway to remove accommodation and remove that emergency accommodation that was so needed at the start of the pandemic and throughout. Now we're in the process of removing it so that we do get inflation under control, while at the same time maintaining a strong economy and the expansion and good labor market conditions. So that process has started. We raised the interest rate last meeting, and we said ongoing interest rate increases are on the table and in the cards. And we've also put out some information about how we are planning to reduce our balance sheet assets that we also bought in great quantities to support the economy during the pandemic. So that process is underway, and that will help to reduce excess demand, which is outpacing constrained supply, and bring price pressures down.
Where do you see inflation by the end of the year?
Yeah, so I think that it will take some time to get inflation down because, as you know, there's other things going on in the economy that are adding to price pressures, including the commodity price increases and energy price increases that are happening as well. So I think inflation will remain above 2% this year and even next year, but the trajectory will be that it will be moving down.
For people on an everyday basis, how they experience the economy, look at numbers like Moody's put out where they said the average person will spend $1,300 more on gas this year if prices stay where they are. You've seen lawmakers and governors talk about things like holidays for gas taxes or cash relief. I know it's fiscal policy, but when you hear things like that, are you afraid that this will add to inflation?
So I do think we have to recognize that there are factors that are beyond monetary policy affecting the inflation numbers. But we have to do what we can do with our policy tools as monetary policymakers to make sure that those inflation and higher prices don't become embedded in the economy. And that's what we're going to be doing with our monetary policy tools. It's no doubt that it's very painful to have these high prices. I mean, it's even worse if you look at low-income consumers, because they spend a greater portion of their consumption basket on the essentials, housing, energy, food, and all those prices have gone up at a higher inflation rate than just the average inflation rate. So this is a serious problem, and it's a real painful problem for many in the country. Wages are going up, so that's a good thing, but for many families, they're not going up at the pace that inflation is going up. So it's very important that we get inflation under control, and that's the biggest challenge right now for the U.S. economy.
The White House argues the true read of the economy is the strong jobs market. Do you believe employment is so strong, too strong to actually generate a recession?
So I think, and I'm optimistic, that we'll be able to remove monetary policy accommodation and maintain good labor market conditions and the expansion. And I believe that for a couple of reasons. One, underlying demand in the economy, if you look at consumption growth and you look at business investment, is very strong. It's not going to be as strong this year as it was last year, but last year the economy grew at 5.5%, which is well above a 2% trend. But the other reason is because we are at emergency levels of accommodation. It's very accommodative. So as we remove that monetary accommodation, right, we're not saying that accommodation or monetary policy will be tight. We're removing accommodation. And so, right, I think we can reduce that excess demand relative to supply without pushing the economy into a recession. So I'm pretty optimistic we can do this. It'll be challenging, but I think we can do it.
So you think Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and Deutsche Bank are wrong when they talk about an increased risk of recession?
No, I think that certainly if you look at the risk, given what's happening in the world and the economy, there is an increased risk. But I remain optimistic, and certainly my modal forecast of what's going to happen this year is that the expansion will continue.
There is so much going on in the world that can complicate the recovery of the economy, whether it's COVID, whether it's the war in Ukraine. I want to ask you about what we are seeing happen right now in Shanghai, China. 25 million people under lockdown. This is a financial hub for this country. Manufacturing hubs in that country also experiencing this. When you see these zero COVID policies in China, do you look at that and you say, that means prices in America will just stay where they are or be pushed higher when there's a COVID lockdown?
So a couple of things is certainly the lockdown in China is going to exacerbate the problems that we have in supply chain. So that is putting upward pressure on prices, and certainly all the businesses that we talk to in my 4th district and elsewhere through the country are saying that we've pushed out when we think the supply chain issues are going to be resolved, right? So not this year, now it's next year. So that certainly adds upward pressure, and that's something we have to consider when we're looking at sort of developments on the ground. But I do think that eventually some of those supply chain problems are going to come back down, and we've seen that over time, right? First, it's in one sector we have supply chain, then that's resolved. Businesses have been incredibly creative and resilient in terms of rejiggering their supply chains. It's a rolling problem, and I think we have to just be aware that that will add upward pressure and keep prices higher for longer.
All right. Loretta Mester, thank you for your insights today. We'll be back in a moment. As we enter peak migration season, the CDC is planning to lift Title 42. That's a pandemic-era policy that restricts asylum-seeking migrants, potentially causing a huge surge at the border. For more, we turn to Jay Johnson, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret.
When we hear from the administration that they could see as many as 18,000 migrants per day crossing that border, it seems incredible. Senate Democrats have said the administration's not prepared. Do you think they are?
Margaret, I'm told by DHS officials, the department I once ran, that they are making preparations, that they are prepared, that there are resources, transportation in place for this level of migration on our southern border. Without a doubt, these are large numbers. DHS, I believe, has learned lessons from the past, in surges in the past, including when I was in office. But still, numbers at these level are difficult to handle on the southern border, communities on the southern border, Catholic charities that volunteers. Difficult to absorb these types of numbers. Under almost any scenario, it's challenging for the Border Patrol, for ICE, to properly process and track these individuals. And obviously, the Biden administration is paying a political cost for these. So my recommendation would be that, and I know President Biden believes this, we have to address the underlying causes in Central America for these types of surges. And I was pleased that in this year's budget proposal, there's $1 billion to try to address this. We began this in the Obama administration, and we need to keep at it through successive administrations.
Right, and that's a long-term solution. But I mean, when it comes to how the Biden administration planned for this pandemic era restriction, Title 42, it's getting peeled back May 23rd. It coincides with the peak migration season. Why wasn't there any coordination within the administration to maybe, I don't know, push it a few months?
Well, Margaret, I'm no longer at the table. I'm no longer in the Situation Room, part of these discussions.
But you would have tried to coordinate it, wouldn't you?
Well, I would have argued that, first of all, there obviously is a recognition that this is an extraordinary authority. It's a public health authority. In the event of a communicable disease, it had to end sometime. The courts were becoming increasingly skeptical. I would have argued that we should keep it in place just a little while longer, till perhaps July, when these numbers do tend to slow down in the hotter weather. You're correct that March, April, May tend to be the peak seasons for migration on our southern border. And so DHS will have a challenge. And I heard the current secretary the other day say at present they have something like 7,000 a day. That's a high number.
You mentioned the political problem this has caused for the administration. There's a bipartisan group of senators now trying to delay the administration's plan to lift this by about 60 days until after the Surgeon General rescinds the COVID public health emergency. Does this sound like a reasonable compromise? Is this something you would endorse?
Well, Margaret, legally, I don't know that a compromise is achievable. Section 265 of Title 42 is a CDC authority. It's up to the CDC to invoke it or suspend it. That's the way the law reads. So if in the judgment of the CDC director, the public health authority this extraordinary authority should be lifted, that is her prerogative, hopefully in consultation in the interagency process with the Department of Homeland Security to ensure that DHS is ready to handle these numbers. Again, I would have argued that we keep it in place just a little longer through the summer until the numbers tend to trail off.
Should there be vaccination at the border that is mandated? I mean, if foreign travelers to the United States who land at an airport have to show proof of it.
I think that is something that should be considered. There are obviously huge challenges to trying to achieve that with this volume of people, but it's something that should be considered.
You mentioned going back to addressing root causes. Both President Biden and Vice President Harris last year also publicly called for migration to slow. I want to play for you what they said in 2021.
Do you have to say quite clearly, don't come?
Yes, I can say quite clearly, don't come.
Do not come.
So why haven't we heard anything like that now? Is it because the administration took so much heat from progressive Democrats?
Margaret, I can only tell you about my own experience dealing with this very, very difficult issue. I have learned that you have to repeat a message dozens and dozens of times before people actually do begin to hear it. The longer term lesson, however, is that migration is a market sensitive phenomenon. It reacts sharply to news in the information marketplace about enhanced enforcement, decreased enforcement on our southern border. We can repeat these messages over and over again, and we should, but as long as the underlying conditions exist, the poverty, violence in Central America exist, the numbers are going to always revert back to their longer-term trend lines. There's no level of defense that can counteract the powerful push factors in Central America. That's something that I know President Biden believes in. We discussed it extensively when he was vice president and I was Secretary of Homeland Security.
Secretary Jeh Johnson, good to have you back on the program. We'll be right back. The Supreme Court now looks more like America. This October, 4 women, one of them a Latina, and now for the first time, a black female justice, will sit on the 9-person Supreme Court. Friday, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson marked her historic confirmation with an emotional speech.
It has taken 232 years, but we've made it. We've made it, all of us, all of us. In my family, it took just one generation to go from segregation to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Following the announcement of the vote Thursday, there was a stunning response on the Senate floor that reflects just how partisan politics has gotten. Democrats cheered as the Republican side of the chamber emptied out. Mitt Romney was one of only 3 Republicans to support Judge Jackson's nomination. And that is it for today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.